This is the true story of a crime so horrifying, it forced an entire nation to confront its own silence. The events you are about to hear are not part of a movie script or a dark novel. They are real, they are documented, and they serve as a chilling reminder of what can happen when good people do nothing. Our story begins in Tokyo in the late 1980s. The city was a beacon of progress and order, a symbol of modern Japan. And within this sprawling metropolis lived a 17-year-old girl named Junko Furuta. She was, by all accounts, a typical high school student. She was quiet, hardworking, and well-liked by her peers and teachers. Junko lived a normal, happy life in a suburb of Tokyo with her parents and 2 brothers. She was responsible, she was trusted, and she had dreams for her future, just like any other teenager. There were absolutely no warning signs, no omens in the sky, to suggest that her ordinary life was about to be stolen from her in the most brutal way imaginable. The date was November 25, 1988. As Junko was making her way home from her part-time job, she was approached by a teenage boy named Hiroshi Miyano. He was known to have connections with a local gang, and he used this reputation to intimidate her. He manufactured a lie, a threat so potent it paralyzed her with fear. He told her that if she didn't come with him, his gang would find her family and harm them. For a girl who loved her family dearly, this was an impossible choice. Fearing for their safety, Junko complied. She was abducted, taken against her will, completely unaware that this was the beginning of a 44-day nightmare from which she would never wake up. Miyano didn't take her to a remote, abandoned warehouse. He took her to a house, a normal house, in a normal neighborhood. It was the home of one of his fellow attackers. What makes this detail so disturbing is that the parents of her captor were present in the house at various times during her captivity. Junko was confined to a small second-floor room. The doors weren't always locked. There were windows she could see out of. Escape seemed physically possible, yet it was an illusion. The psychological chains of fear were stronger than any lock. Her captors had convinced her that any attempt to flee would result in unspeakable violence against her family, a threat she believed completely. The first few days of her captivity were marked by the abrupt and violent stripping away of her freedom and identity. The beatings began almost immediately. She was no longer Junko Furuta, a student with a future. She was a possession, an object for their cruelty. They forced her to call them her friends, a twisted psychological game designed to break her spirit. In a desperate act of courage, she did try to escape. She even managed to dial the police once, but her captors caught her before she could speak. Her bravery was met with swift and brutal punishment, extinguishing any hope she had left. What started as beatings and confinement quickly escalated into something far more sinister. The abuse became ritualistic, a daily schedule of torment. The violence wasn't random, it was systematic. She was starved for days on end. They inflicted burns on her body. The beatings were constant and severe, but the torture wasn't just physical. They engaged in relentless psychological warfare, designed to erase her humanity entirely. And then it got worse. Her captors began inviting other teenagers over to the house. The torture of Junko Furuta became a form of grotesque entertainment. Groups of boys would come and go, participating in the violence as if it were a party. The small room in that suburban house became a stage for unimaginable cruelty. The most haunting part of this story might be the sounds that emanated from that house. The screams, the cries for help. Later, during the investigation, neighbors would testify that they heard them. They admitted to hearing loud noises, arguments, and what sounded like a young woman in distress. But these screams were dismissed. Some assumed it was just a loud domestic dispute. Others simply chose to ignore it, not wanting to get involved in someone else's business. In a society that values privacy and non-interference, the cries for help faded into the background noise of daily life. Not a single person called the police, not once. In that neighborhood, silence became complicity. The walls of the houses were thin, but the wall of indifference was impenetrable. As the weeks dragged on, Junko's body began to fail her. The constant abuse, the starvation, and the infections took their toll. She deteriorated to a point where she could no longer stand on her own. Her voice grew weak, and her screams became whimpers. She was barely conscious, a shadow of the vibrant young woman she once was. Yet, the torture didn't stop. Even as she lay dying, her captors continued their assault. At this point, the violence had no purpose. It wasn't about control or intimidation anymore. It was cruelty for its own sake, a horrifying display of what happens when human empathy is completely extinguished. The final night came on January 4th, 1989. After 44 days of unimaginable suffering, Junko's broken body finally gave out. She died on the cold floor of that room. There was no last-minute rescue, no moment of compassion from her captors. When they realized she was dead, their cruelty was instantly replaced by panic. They had not just tortured a girl, they had committed murder. No one called for an ambulance or the police. Their only thought was how to cover up their crime. To erase the evidence of their monstrous actions, they came up with a grim plan. They took Junko's body and forced it into a 55-gallon oil drum. They then filled the drum with wet concrete, entombing her inside. Under the cover of darkness, they drove to a land reclamation site in Tokyo Bay and dumped the heavy drum, watching it sink beneath the surface. They believed their secret was safe, that Junko Furuta had simply vanished, and that concrete and water would hide their crime forever. But secrets like this rarely stay buried. The truth came to light through an unexpected channel. One of the main attackers, Hiroshi Miyano, was arrested shortly after for an unrelated crime. During his interrogation, police officers noticed his unease and began pressing him. Under questioning, the entire horrifying story began to unravel. He confessed, leading the police to the other perpetrators and eventually to the drum in Tokyo Bay. Divers were sent down and Junko's body was recovered. As the details of her 44 days of captivity emerged, the nation of Japan was stunned into a state of collective shock and horror. The subsequent trial brought the full sickening extent of the abuse into the public eye. However, many of the most graphic details were deemed too disturbing to be released. The courtroom heard testimony of acts so vile they defied comprehension. But another factor complicated the proceedings: the age of the attackers. Because they were all minors at the time of the crime, they were tried as juveniles. This meant they were afforded legal protections, including the concealment of their real names, and were subject to much lighter sentencing guidelines. As the verdicts were read, public outrage exploded across Japan. The sentences handed down were seen by many as a profound injustice. The primary captors received sentences that, to the public, felt shockingly lenient for the magnitude of their crimes. Some of them would end up serving less than a decade in prison before being released back into society. Due to juvenile protection laws, their identities were largely shielded from the public record, allowing them to eventually rebuild their lives in anonymity. For Junko's family, there was no justice, no closure. They were left with only the terrible truth of what had happened to their daughter and the knowledge that her killers would walk free. In the aftermath, the case of Junko Furuta became more than just a crime story. It became a symbol of a deep societal failure. It forced Japan into a period of national reckoning, raising difficult questions about parental responsibility, the justice system, and the bystander effect. Why did no one help? How could this happen in a modern, orderly society? The case triggered widespread debate about legal reforms for juvenile criminals and the cultural tendency to turn a blind eye to the problems of others. Junko Furuta's name became seared into the nation's consciousness, a name Japan will never forget, representing the ultimate cost of apathy. This was not a mystery that needed solving. This was not a story of supernatural horror. It was a real horror story, written by human hands and enabled by fear, silence, and indifference. It serves as a stark and brutal lesson. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't hiding in the dark. They're living right next door, and no one stops them.